The illiberal arts, and I'm not making that up, artis illiberalis is a term, right? It's Aristotelian, it gets translated into Latin, very important for the development of universities. They were the mechanical arts. They're what kids of working class often did. They were the trades. They were architecture. They were farming, right? They were bits of the applied mathematics. These were the illiberal arts. And Aristotle says, and you know it has to be right, because it's Aristotle, quote, illiberal arts make the learner mechanical and make the body, soul, or intellect of free men unserviceable for the external exercise of goodness and freedom, unquote. So we have an inherent prejudice, in a sense, against the mechanical arts. That's phenomenally powerful. It's ancient Greek, it gets reified during Christian Aristotelianism and the rise of universities in the West, and it's very strong in the Enlightenment. Kant is Enlightenment. Indeed, the word Enlightenment, Aufklärung, actually appears first in German. It's Kant, a very famous essay, Was ist Aufklärung, what is Enlightenment, that Kant talks about. So this is the dichotomy I want to study, right? And because I'm fatter than most, I get 30 rather than 18 minutes per day. Is the notion of freedom, the notion that the mechanical arts are not free, they are, and they're hooked up with a commercial nexus, and the liberal arts are free, and therefore are somehow more liberated, more of the knowledge of the savant. And feel free to throw anything or ask questions. It's not like I'm very well organized, you can tell from my notes, but we'll move on. So, 2 episodes I want to talk briefly about today is where I've come across the notion of Handwerk and its implication for science and technology. One is, I mean, it turns out I'm trained in the natural, I play molecular biology and physics, but I also have a degree in German literature. And I was always fascinated by 18th and 19th century Germany. I was always, they were pretty good in musicians, rumor has it, and they had really good writers and really good philosophers. And I was interested in that nexus, and I was interested in looking at automata, musical automata. Because this arose in the 18th, it was starting with von Casson in France in the early 18th century, up through including the 19th and 20th centuries. Musical automata play a very interesting role aesthetically and commercially and economically in Europe, as well as the United States. And one interesting question is, what is the relationship between an automaton that plays a musical piece and an organic performer? Can an automaton replace a performer? Can an automaton play with equal beauty as an automaton? Now, I'm a child of the 70s, right? And there was a great commercial, was Ella Fitzgerald singing, and it was a tape recording. And they play it, and the question was, is it live or is it Memorex? This is the 18th and 19th century version of, is it live or is it Memorex? And if you ever, I mean, I'm sure it's on YouTube, it's a great, one of the great commercials of all time. Now, E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote in German because he was, and you can probably guess that that's the Sandman. Not too tricky, see, German's really easy. In 1816, that's a story about a young college student who unwittingly falls in love with an automaton called Olympia. So you can make all fun of your poly students by calling them, asking them if they fall in love with an automaton. It's very embarrassing, but it's about a relationship between a human being and an automaton and what that means, right? How is it that a machine can mimic all of the important attributes of being a human? In Automata in 1814, 2 years later, the 2 main characters, Ludwig and Ferdinand, are appalled by the possibility that somehow a lifeless machine can produce all of human emotions. It can love, it can hate, it can be envious, it can produce music better than an organic performer. Right. So the interesting point is, what in the world is this about? Ludwig basically in Automata says, look, it's impossible for a cold, lifeless machine to produce something so tender and loving as a violin sonata or a piano sonata. It's impossible, absolutely impossible. Well, the mechanicians, the Handwerker, said, bring it on. No, it's not. And we're going to create these kind of machines so that you literally do not know if it's an automaton or a living person playing a particular piece. That was the challenge, and the gauntlet was dropped. There were a lot of debates about all of this in 19th century Germany by rather brilliant people. The famous philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or Hegel for short, basically was very concerned that mechanical music was destroying musical spiritual element, quoting Hegel. The performing artist must submit himself entirely to the character of the work, but he must not, as happens often enough, sink to becoming merely mechanical, which only barrel organ performers are allowed to be. If art is still to be in question, The artiste has a duty to give it life and soul to the work, unquote. And things apparently hadn't changed all that much in the 1840s. Heinrich Heine, also a very famous German poet, who wisely left the German territories to hang out in Paris, I would have too at the time, decided to be very upset with the city of Paris was totally influenced by Franz Liszt mania. That was the great pianist Franz Liszt sweeping Europe. Right? And if you went to Paris, it was ridiculous. It's like everyone singing that song, na 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 na, I want to start a fight, but it was a little bit more complicated because it was, after all, Liszt playing and composing. It was all the rage, and Heine said, this is horrible, quote, mechanical perfection, the precision of an automaton, the identification of the musician with stringed wood, the transformation of a man into an instrument of sound is what is now praised and exalted as the highest art in the streets of Paris. An interesting shift had occurred. You now had virtuosi mimicking the precision of the automaton. And people like one of the greatest violinists of all time, Niccolo Paganini, who literally changed the repertoire of the violin, the greatest pianist of the 19th century, perhaps of all time, Franz Liszt, who, by the way, was the first person to turn the piano sideways so that the audience could see his hands. Because a performer was not only something that played well, you had to see the performance. It was really a spectacle to behold. Right? That's an important shift in performance. These guys said, right, bring it on. Automata are going to try to imitate us. We're going to try to imitate an automata. How? By playing rapidly, by doing double trills. Things that machines can do, we humans can do too. So there's an amazing contest in the 19th century between the virtuosi and the machines. Now, while febrile imaginations feared the creation of musician replacing automata, which flawlessly executed the composition of a piece ad infinitum, in the cacophonous world of the Industrial Revolution, what's happening? Machines are replacing skilled labor, right? The weaving loom, for example. Machines, and Karl Marx got this right, you might want to hear it out here, was that this was about the change in the notion of skill. And if a machine can replace you, you by definition are no longer skilled, right? That's critical. And so we have this question, I mean, one of the greatest authors of all time, the smartest person of the 20th century, they gave it to Albert Einstein. Footnote, that's, fair enough, go. The most brilliant person of the 20th century was a German journalist who committed suicide fleeing the Nazis in 1940 by the name of Walter Benjamin, or as you might say, Walter Benjamin. Right? And he basically talks about the mechanical reproduction of art. And this is basically what this is about. He's interested in visual things. I'm interested more in musical, in music and sound. But rather, what's the point here? Rather than marveling at the exquisitely beautiful artifact, that one table that is masterly crafted, that one performance of Beethoven, the Kreutzer, that is just phenomenal, you have the ideology of mass production. The production of a single thing, over and over again, with total fidelity. That is the aesthetic of the Industrial Revolution. And it's called an aesthetic, right? So you have the master craftsman, the single great performance, the single great violin or table, versus producing the same piece ad infinitum in the same exact way, time after time after time. And both are referred to as aesthetic. Different aesthetic, but still equally considered aesthetics. Indeed, a great example, Andrew Ure was a chemist and a philosopher manufacturer who praised machines coming into British factories. Why? Because they can be run by cheap labor. The cheap labor, of course, were children. He believed in child labor. Dickens goes after Andrew Ure. Footnote, so too does Karl Marx, rather famously. David Brewster, you might know, he's a very famous natural philosopher, did a lot of work on optics. And he writes in 1819, in a book that introduced his invention, the kaleidoscope. He's the one who invented the kaleidoscope. And I quote, "There are few machines indeed which rise higher above the operations of human skill. It will create, the kaleidoscope, will create in a single hour what 1,000 artists could not invent in the course of a year. And while it works with such unexampled rapidity, it works also with a corresponding beauty and precision." Right? So here you have something interesting. The kaleidoscope did not produce the same image over and over again like an automaton would, but rather it could improve upon the creativity of the artist.